Hello and welcome to Editor's Pick, a War Elephant podcast, episode 20. I'm your host Ian, and I have with me Jaden.
Hello.
And as we were talking about various things we could discuss tonight for your pleasure, which is perhaps an unfortunate choice of words, we decided the website and culture of OnlyFans. For those who may not know, OnlyFans is a website devoted to paid content. So it's similar to Patreon. However, even though they advertise that they're available for any kind of paid content, from crafts to lifestyle to anything, OnlyFans is most famous and it makes the most money from sex work, specifically pornography, nudity, and sexually provocative images from people who upload it themselves. So before we get too far into our discussion of OnlyFans, its effect on culture, some things that people often don't talk about when it comes to OnlyFans, I thought it would be good if Jaden and I shared a bit of our own perspectives on sex work in general. And since this is a conservative podcast, I'm sure that our views will not be super surprising, but I wanted to get our biases out of the way. So, Jaden, go ahead and let us know what your thoughts are.
Well, to put it in the least harsh terms that I can think of at the moment, it would have to be I strongly disapprove of the practice. I think it degrades men and women. I think that it devalues the concept of sex and a sexual relationship between a man and his wife. In the simplest terms, in the least harsh terms that I could think of, yes, that would probably have to be my view.
Certainly, as a Christian, I agree with Jaden's perspective there, but my perspective on sex work, prostitution, stripping, and pornography is that it's telling a lie about sex and sexuality. It's saying that sex is basically just a physical good, something you can pay for that is transient, like a drug or food. And I think that even if you're not a Christian, as I am and as Jaden is, I think sex can be best understood as a relational act, an act which has effects before, after, and during the physical act of sex itself. It's not just something that happens and then it's done. It's something that happens and has emotional and relational consequences long into the future. And I think that OnlyFans and pornography and sex work in general is not truthful about that, even apart from the fact that I believe that the vast majority of sex work of all kinds is deeply abusive. Even in the most ideal cases, I think that sex work is telling the lie that sex is only physical, only commodified. So that's where we're coming from. We're definitely not pro-sex work, but I would clarify that I'm very pro-sex worker. I would want them to be protected against all abuse and harassment. Even though I think sex work should generally be illegal, I think that that is no excuse for beating or mocking or shaming them. We found a couple of articles, and all of these will be in the show notes because there's a lot of articles in this podcast, which started out by showing how OnlyFans presents itself and how a specific segment of powerful media voices attempt to present OnlyFans to the public. The first is an article on ABC News called Selling Sexy, the men and women of OnlyHams discuss reality behind the scenes. This article claims to share the highs and lows of their experience on the site. However, when I read through this article, it felt like a wholly paid-for piece of puff promotion for OnlyFans. It's all about content creators have control over their lives and they make so much money and it's such a positive thing. And the lows are like, oh, well, some people treat me mean about it. It does not at all talk about any real difficulties. And if you came away from this article thinking, oh, OnlyFans might be for me, I think you're actually reading the article as it was intended to be read.
This is a trend amongst a lot of different media sources recently, and it's really concerning because people, young women, read these articles and think that it's for them, and they think that it'll solve all their problems. They'll get all the money they could ever dream of, and they just have to take lewd pictures of themselves and post them online. It's almost like these companies pushing these articles, they have a vested interest in convincing young women to go into sex work. I'm always baffled by this sort of stuff. The framing of these articles. There's another article from Business Insider, even though this article is actually from 2016, August 2016. This Business Insider article. The ABC News article that we brought up was from February of this year, actually just last week. They sound like paid for ads. They're long form articles that try to convince, with the intention of convincing young women to do this. And it doesn't explain any of the problems. It makes it all sunshine and rainbows. It baffles me.
And interestingly, one of the people interviewed for this ABC article was named Kristen Vaughn. And we're going to talk about her later in another article at the end of the discussion topics, because this article was written after the other article. This article is dated February of this year, 2021, for anyone listening in the future. But in 2020, Kristen Vaughn lost her job as a direct consequence of having a prominent OnlyFans account. And this article doesn't mention that, and I think that is very, very dishonest in terms of an article promising to tell the lows, and it seems to really just be talking about the highs, and I think that's very troubling. The second article, so it's an article on Business Insider written by the top creator on OnlyFans, who goes by the stage name Ayala, and she talks about what she does on a typical day. And apparently, they say she makes something like $100,000 a month. And this article is full of just consumeristic pictures of her living space and herself in semi-undressed clothing. So it's all about presenting her as an appealing figure that people would want to emulate, would want to copy. And I think that's very disturbing. And this article is actually from 2016, back when the site launched. We also have a piece from the very interesting women's magazine website Evie, which talks about how social media turns strippers into influencers and glamorizes sex work. And this is a much more honest look at the way sex workers in general face challenges, the negatives that are directly related to their job, and the financial realities. And that launches us into the second main topic of our podcast tonight, which is the financial realities of OnlyFans. These articles we've just posted, at least the first two, attempt to paint OnlyFans as a get-rich-quick scheme, requiring just taking nude pictures of yourself and you'll make thousands and thousands of dollars a month, way more than you could make if you were working a drudge job in a local fast food restaurant. The reality is much more like a pyramid or multi-level marketing scheme, which is that there are a very, very small handful of people who make enormous amounts of money, and then there's a vast thousands and thousands of people who make very, very little. So the first article, again, from Evie magazine, is the one that makes the direct comparison to the pyramid scheme. And it does admit that it's not strictly like a pyramid scheme, but then again, a multi-layer marketing scheme is not strictly like a pyramid scheme, but anyone who looks at them honestly will see the similarities. I also highlighted another article on the outline, which is called "No One Makes a Living on Patreon," which shows that the most popular non-explicit crowdfunding income generation website, Patreon, which I believe does restrict sexual content. I don't think they're allowed to do the kinds of stuff that you can do on OnlyFans. They also try and present themselves as anyone can make lots of money on Patreon. But instead, it's, again, just a handful of people are making significant amounts of money, and many thousands of people are making very, very little. So, Jaden, what do you think about the way, the contrast between the way they're trying to sell OnlyFans and the financial realities of these crowdfunding income generation websites?
It's something that, as I've mentioned before, it absolutely baffles me that this sort of thing goes on. I've already mentioned this, but it makes me wonder if the people pushing this have a vested interest, whether that be financial or whatever else, in getting young women into sex work. Because obviously it's not out of the goodness of their heart, because if you look at the statistics, the vast, vast, vast majority of content creators, whether that be on OnlyFans or Patreon or any other organization with a similar format, they don't make any money whatsoever. I'm going to throw up some statistics, or you'll check the show notes. It'll have some graphs with the data. The numbers are absolutely baffling. And these articles do a very good job of breaking it down. The EV article on how OnlyFans is like a pyramid scheme, and the one that Ian had found about Patreon, and how only 2% actually make the minimum wage on Patreon. It's something almost beyond logic.
Well, it's like the gold rush, and I'm sure a more socialist perspective would say it's like the American dream. I think it is true that both the gold rush and the American dream have a sort of asymptotic graph approach. If you look at the people who make huge amounts of money versus the amount of people who make what we would consider a normal amount of money. Whereas I think the gold rush, actually only a few people really hit it rich, and a lot of people just barely scraped by making, panning and stuff for gold. But there's always that impulse to get rich quick, to get a lot of money for a comparative little amount of work or a little amount of time. And this is especially appealing for people in creative industries, because art has always had difficulty sustaining itself, because it's a luxury quality. It's not something that everyone can afford to pay someone to make a living at. So I do see the appeal of crowdfunding income generation websites. I'm not against them, but I think that people should be more educated about the realities of crowdfunding income generation, which is that the vast majority of people simply don't make very much money at all. And this is very true of OnlyFans. And I think that we need to be realistic, as the EV magazine article points out, about the perils and the instability of sex work, in addition to the fact that only a couple of creators actually make anywhere close to a lot of money, let alone a living wage. In fact, in the Twitter graph that we've linked in our show notes, there's a reply that makes a joke that probably isn't actually that untrue, which is that Ayala, the woman who wrote the Day in the Life article we highlighted earlier, is the only one really making $100,000 a month. everyone else is making much, much less money than she is. So I think that it is very harmful that a website with the kind of reach and reputation of telling the truth as ABC, at least among certain demographics, would be running what really amounts to an advertisement for OnlyFans without being honest about the downsides. Jaden, when you were a kid, did you ever have any training in advertising, in how to read an advertisement?
We had some classes in, I wouldn't really say civics, but it was like a class where you would try to understand the world around you. It was along the same veins, but it wasn't just about the United States government, but about the world. And one of the topics, one of the units was on understanding advertising and understanding articles from news organizations, stuff like that, using a critical mind to deconstruct what you're consuming so that you don't fall prey to the narrative they're trying to sell you.
I asked because I actually got training in advertising rating as a kid too. My mom, I was a homeschooler, and so my mom actually showed me a video series called Buy Me That and Buy Me That Too, in which they looked at a lot of toy commercials in the 90s, as well as a few food commercials. And they looked at what was being promised and then what you actually got. So they'd buy the product, take it out of the package, and see if it did anything like what the commercial showed it doing. And the answer was almost always absolutely not. These toys did not do anything like what the commercials promised them. They also talked about food commercials, how in a food commercial about cereal, the milk is almost always going to be glue because milk looks blue on film and glue is going to look white. A lot of food is going to be plastic or otherwise manipulated in non-edible ways. And if something is promised to be in a box and you don't know what's in the box, you're going to have to buy something like 20 or 30 times more of that thing than if they just sold it to you straight. So the promise of something in every box, like a cereal box or a blind bag of cards, is a lie designed to sell you more of the thing than what you want. So I think that if we had more training in how to read advertisements, articles like this ABC or this Business Insider article would not be as dangerous. But we don't have widespread advertisement literacy. And I think it's very, very dangerous. I mean, we all know of the dangers of sexting, right? If a young woman emails or texts a nude picture of herself to her boyfriend and then they break up, there's just such danger that the boyfriend will share it. And even if they don't break up, I read an article in a print magazine like 5 or 6 years ago about sexting where the boyfriend just shared the picture of his girlfriend naked, sort of like bragging. He wasn't trying to hurt her. He was just like, oh yeah, my girlfriend's so hot. And that was so devastating to this girl because she was in high school and everybody had seen her naked now. But I think it's also because sex is a relationship, it's not a commodity. There's more pressure than just, it's not just a selfie. It's not just, to go super old fashioned. It's not just a lock of your hair. It's not just a signature or a letter. It's something that has real consequences long term for your relationship with everyone who is involved in that sexual transaction. And this is a good segue, I think, into the final article, which is from BuzzFeed about that young woman named Kristen Vaughn, who was a mechanic, and she was fired when her coworkers found out about her OnlyFans account. And she was harassed. And again, I want to make it 100% clear. I don't care what someone does. I don't care if they post pictures. I don't care if they walk around nude. that is not a justification for abuse, harassment, or inappropriate comments. Now, if you walk around nude, that in itself is inappropriate, and I don't really know how you're supposed to respond appropriately other than handing someone a coat. But I want to be clear that my extremely negative opinion of OnlyFans is not about a disgust at the young women who choose to use that to try and earn some money. It's a disgust at the people who are exploiting those young women and the young men who are destroying their ability to have a healthy sexual relationship by having these fantasy relationships with women who don't know them. And Jaden, I think you had some really good thoughts on, the fact that in addition to being socially devastating to young women, this is an extremely poisonous thing for young men as well.
To start with, there's no production of something if there's not a consumption of it. If it weren't for a lot of young men who don't want to put in the time to actually developing a relationship with a woman they know in real life that they will hopefully one day marry and have a wonderful life with, they stunt themselves by getting themselves caught in something that I think is called a parasocial relationship. It's more in their own mind than it is anything real.
And you don't have all the things that are difficult about relationships that make relationships rewarding.
Yep.
So you don't have the responsibility to wash your girlfriend or wife's dishes. You don't have the responsibility of fixing her car. You don't have the responsibility of changing your behavior if she doesn't like it when you burp or, you have to do things for each other in a real relationship. And these parasocial sexual relationships where it's all about the visual and maybe the audio. I mean, there's some famous ones who do live streams where they strip or say sexual things on camera. That has none of the difficulties that build maturity, that build real intimacy. Instead, it's all this false intimacy based entirely on this transaction. This relationship is not real because it offers all of the temporary...
I would absolutely agree with that.
Yeah, it's just... Go ahead.
I would actually like to elaborate on how transactional it is. Because if you have a relationship with someone and it's built on this transaction of, I'll give you this if you give me this, it's not a real relationship. It's anything but. It's more saddening to me than anything that so many young men and women get caught up in this entire scheme. They don't realize the damage it's doing to them and their futures.
There's some statistics that have been floating around a lot recently that teenagers are not having sex as early as they used to. And I think in some ways that is good because early sexuality is often a sign of early adulthood instability, especially if it leads to pregnancy. Whether that pregnancy is carried to term or not, there's trauma involved and a responsibility and a loss of a lot of opportunity. And it also tends to damage your ability to have future relationships, which is one of the reasons that I say that sex is not just the same as cooking a meal for someone or giving them a selfie or a letter. It's more. It's relational and it has long-term consequences. Even if you aren't a Christian, even if you don't have that, the statistics on early sexuality and numbers of sexual partners, all of these have a clear picture that sexual behavior is a long-term significant behavior. It is not the same as eating food. And I think that the lie about sexuality, that it is just transactional, is just something that is over and done with once you orgasm, is so destructive. And I think that the rise of OnlyFans and, of course, the rise of just regular pornography on the internet is part of the reason why young men, and some young women, but it was I think mostly young men who had a sharp drop in early sexual activity. And I think that is, while it's partly positive that they're not having early sexual activity in person, they're still having sexual activity. And they're building patterns that will not serve them well when they have a real girlfriend or a real wife that they have to deal with the hard things that living with another person bring about. If you feel like you can get sex or a sexual pleasure from just a picture or a video, why would you put up with the difficulty of someone who has moods, who will be hurt sometimes, who will not want to have sex sometimes? Why would you put up with that if you can just get the sex from, your picture or video? And I think that's so just destructive to society as a whole. Jaden, any last thoughts?
Well, there was a couple things I wanted to double back on, actually.
Do you mean circle back, like our beloved secretary? What is her title again? Press secretary,
Yep.
likes to say.
Yep. I actually wanted to circle back to how Patreon and OnlyFans are like pyramid schemes, almost. And I would extend that to every single content creator website, YouTube and Twitter. Obviously, it's more about monetized things like YouTube and perhaps Spotify as well, where almost all of the money being made, all of the fame only goes to a select few. So a lot of people, and I think this is actually a better point to make about YouTubers and influencers on Instagram and Twitter, because there's actually some studies that I've been looking at that found the number one job that kids want to grow up to be is an online influencer or YouTuber. And it's by no small margin either. It's like pretty far up there on the list. I think that's a very concerning trend in modern America and the modern Western world. I really can't speak for other countries, but I know that's the case in the United States. A lot of children and young adults, they think that they can just make some YouTube videos and suddenly become the next PewDiePie.
Agreed. I think that we have to become a culture that values hard work and building things rather than attempting to imitate success in a quick way. And I think that there's a parallel here between a business model that attempts to copy something successful quickly and the imitation of a relationship that OnlyFans or pornography or sex works provides. I think that both of them are a sign of a lack of maturity. And I think that one of the things that we really want as a community at War Elephant is to build pathways to maturity, help people to understand the maturity that comes with denying yourself a pleasure in favor of a greater pleasure later, or disagreeing with someone but having a relationship with them that is committed to mutual help anyway. And this is my segue into our normal thing of, if you liked this video, please like it, subscribe to our YouTube channel, subscribe to us on any of the many podcast platforms that we're on. Leave us a review or a comment on YouTube. And a big thing is, do join our community. The link to our Discord server is in the description of this podcast. And if for anyone who is a conservative or more libertarian and really disagrees with us on sexual ethics and sex work, please, we would like to talk to you. And if you'd like to come on this podcast and express your perspective on this, and we can talk about it from with a conservative view and maybe a libertarian or even a liberal view, we are more than happy to have you come on this podcast and talk about your perspective and how we can sort of negotiate that and maybe learn some things from each other. So join us on our Discord community. Let us know, get to know us, share us, join the conversation. I want to thank Jaden for joining me on this podcast and giving us the idea for this conversation. We're hoping to have a follow-up to this, at least one. And again, if there's people who disagree with us and want to join us on the podcast to express that disagreement, maybe more than one. This is certainly a long-term issue. This is, unlike a lot of the stuff we talk about, this isn't a rip from the headlines thing. This is something that's been going on since a very long time, since broadband internet allowed fast video and high quality images to be shared very easily. So this topic's not going away. Join us on our community on Discord, and we'll be happy to talk about it. And until we see you next time, I hope that you will continue to listen to Editor's Pick, the War Elephant podcast.